As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So Iran said on Monday night that its forces launched ballistic missile strikes in Iraq and Syria that targeted spy headquarters and the gathering of anti-Iranian terrorist groups. And this comes as regional tensions continue to soar. So Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, said the strikes in Syria targeted ISIS members who were involved in the recent bombing in Kerman, Iran, which killed 94 people. So that was the attack that targeted a commemoration ceremony for Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general head of the Quds Force who was killed by the U.S. back in 2020. And ISIS took responsibility for that, so they said that they hit some ISIS members in Syria. I'm not sure exactly where the strikes were, but the ones in Iraq seem to be more substantial. They are claiming that they targeted espionage headquarters of Israel's Mossad spy agency, and this was in Iraqi Kurdistan's capital of Erbil in the northern part of Iraq. Multiple missile strikes were reported in Erbil near the U.S. consulate, but there's no indication right now that the facility was hit. When this story first broke, there was stuff all over Twitter that the U.S. consulate was hit by Iran. You know, that makes it seem that definitely worried people and myself, because if Iran and the U.S. Directly attack each other, that could mean a big war. But a U.S. official told ABC News, quote, "No U.S. facilities were impacted. We are not tracking damage to infrastructure or injuries at this time," end quote. So Iran did not specify why it targeted the alleged Mossad headquarters, but the strikes come about a month and a half after Israel killed a senior IRGC official in Syria. Basically, as far as I understand it, it was the IRGC's head officer in Syria. So that was a big deal that Israel killed him. And Iran has previously targeted the area in response to an Israeli attack. And Israeli assets and operatives are known to be in Iraqi Kurdistan. So the New Jersey National Guard is preparing to deploy 1,500 troops to Iraq and Syria amid a spate of attacks on U.S. bases in the two countries that started in mid-October over Biden's support for Israel. It's unclear if this deployment is part of a scheduled troop rotation or if they are being sent to reinforce the U.S. military presence in the region. I haven't seen anything. To me, I'm guessing this is a regular troop rotation and that they're not. I just haven't heard anything about the U.S. sending additional forces to Iraq and Syria. This was reported by CBS News. They just had this little short report speaking with some of these National Guard soldiers who were deploying. Didn't mention anything about all these attacks in Iraq and Syria. It's pretty unbelievable that that context was left out of the report. According to the Pentagon, U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria have come under at least 130 drone, rocket, and mortar attacks since October 17th, and the attacks have injured 69 American soldiers. An umbrella group of Shia militias that calls itself the Islamic Resistance of Iraq has taken credit for most of the attacks, and we've seen the U.S. launch airstrikes in response in eastern Syria and Iraq, and the Iraqi government is very unhappy and calling for an end to the U.S. presence. So they were actually asked about this report, and the Iraqi government denied that the U.S. was sending reinforcements. And Tahsin al-Kafali, who's a spokesman for the Iraqi Operations Command, says that Iraq does not need any foreign troops. That was his response when asked about this report. So the U.S. leads an international coalition in Iraq known as Operation Inherent Resolve that helps fight ISIS. Although these days it's clear that the U.S. presence is about countering Iran, and they don't want to give up. They just don't want to give up the bases there in general. The U.S. military is still involved in anti-ISIS operations in Iraq. I linked to a report there from U.S. Central Command. They put out these monthly reports on their operations against ISIS, and This was the last one that I saw they posted. This was for the month of November, which said U.S. Central Command, along with coalition and other forces, conducted a total of 40 ISIS operations, resulting in 4 ISIS operatives killed and 33 detained. And that was in both Iraq and Syria. In Iraq, there was 24 partnered operations. Usually the U.S. forces aren't directly involved in those these days, at least. That's mostly the Iraqi government forces with U.S. support. But I was talking to Scott Horton about this today, and we were talking about how a lot of people probably don't realize that the U.S. has been involved in military operations against ISIS still in Iraq and Syria. Last year in 2020, what year is it? In like the beginning of 2023, end of 2022, there was actually a lot of U.S. drone strikes in Syria against ISIS, a lot of raids targeting what they call ISIS leaders. But anyway, Iraq says that they can handle these ISIS remnants because that's all they are. They don't control any significant territory. And then over in Syria, you got the Syrian government, their allies, the Kurds that the U.S. backs. If the U.S. pulls out, they'll all fight against ISIS. It's not like there's a chance of the caliphate being brought back or anything. If anything, ISIS is benefiting from the Shia militias firing at the U.S. because those are ISIS's enemies as well. They're benefiting from kind of this chaos. So this article is from Jason Ditz. As top British officials defend the decision to join the U.S. in attacks on Yemen, British Defense Secretary Grant Shapps has informed Parliament of potential wars in the years to come with several major nations, including Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. So he's hitting most of them. And he described the situation as a pre-war phase and cautioned that wars with one or more of these nations could break out within the next 5 years. Britain would, of course, be directly involved, and they would follow anything that the U.S. does. Probably, they'd go right along with the U.S.
The State of Israel is singularly aware of why the Genocide Convention, which has been invoked in these proceedings, was adopted. Seared in our collective memory is the systematic murder of 6 million Jews as part of a premeditated and heinous program for their total annihilation. Given the Jewish people's history and its foundational texts, it is not surprising that Israel was among the first states to ratify the Genocide Convention without reservation and to incorporate its provisions in its domestic legislation.
So, the arguments went on for three and a half hours on Thursday in favor of the South African application, not generally available in the Western world. The arguments went on for three and a half hours on Friday, opposing the South African application, generally available everywhere in the West. Is it a common belief in the intelligence community that the U.S. can manipulate this court?
Well, yes. Any court or any UN body is a lucrative target for such manipulation.
I want to ask you about the corruption of the court. I don't mean bribery type corruption, but I mean, is there political corruption? Is there pressure on these judges? Because the court really issues what we would say what we'd call in America an advisory opinion. They don't have an army to enforce their opinion. Their ruling. They can condemn the Israelis for genocide, and that's not going to move a hair on the head of Prime Minister Netanyahu, unless I'm misreading this right.
Well, it will be a big deal, Judge. In other words, if Israel is made even more a pariah and people follow through with economic measures that weaken Israel and force it to buy more and more on the United States, that will be significant. You're right. It has no enforcement capability. And worse still, I don't know when the judgment's going to come down. No one does that I know of. Some people are saying, well, it should be quick. And of course, Barrister Bellini said, yeah, sure, it should be quick. It's urgent. But, there's all kinds of delaying tactics. You know better than I how many games can be played. And I heard from my friend Ed Snowden via Twitter. And what he said was, I worked in the CIA station under Bush and Cheney, just down the street from the UN bodies in Geneva. And any chance we got, we surged our capability against their communications and everything else. So, there's lots of room. I would be surprised, says Ed, if the U.S. station there, FBI, CIA, NSA, are not surging their capability against all people having to do with the International Court of Justice, even though they meet in The Hague, the headquarters is in Geneva.
What would could the CIA or the NSA do mechanically to influence the outcome or impede the work of the court?
Well, there are about 15 judges there, right?
Right.
How many of those have skeletons in their closet? How many of those would not reveal some of the things that could easily be found out by these specialists in the covert action part of the CIA and the very, very, very sophisticated measures that the NSA employs abroad? Now, that's all fair game in terms of what the U.S. law allows abroad. But when it impinges on an important case like this, it's really, really irredeemably bad. And that's exactly what they tried before the war in Iraq. Remember, they were trying to get the Security Council to approve this war in Iraq, and they couldn't do it. And so they surged their capability, the Brits and the United States, against all the members of the Security Council in that venue. And they still failed. But who knows how susceptible many of these judges would be. And I don't know, Judge, does it have to be unanimous? I don't know how this thing works with the International Court of Justice.
No, it can be a vote of 8-7.
Good. That's a good sign.
Yeah, so the court has 13 justices, but in a case like this, each of the countries involved can add a justice. So the Israelis added an 87-year-old former Chief Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court. Interestingly, a notorious opponent of Prime Minister Netanyahu. And the South Africans added a former justice of their Supreme Court. So 8-7 can do it. I think you're quite right, Ray, on both counts, that this will lend a lot of moral suasion throughout the world against the Israelis if the court rules that way. And if they make their ruling just on the basis of the arguments, it's not even a close call. On the other hand, if the intelligence community wants to threaten these judges subtly, sort of the way it does to members of Congress to keep increasing the budgets of the intelligence community, it certainly knows how to do so. Is Israel in the PR war its own worst enemy?
Well, Judge, the first target for Israeli propaganda are Israeli citizens themselves, and they need precious little encouragement to be angry and to be ready and eager to wreak vengeance on the Hamas and all the Palestinians. Now, with respect to its position abroad, well, let's face it, the Israeli influence, the lobby influence on our media is appreciable. Now, you pointed out, I'll say it again. You want to talk about one-sided coverage? Well, Thursday session, nothing. Friday session, when the Israelis testify, everything. Now, hello, do you need more description for a one-sided coverage? So that's what we face in the United States. That now in the south of this world and elsewhere, of course, the Israelis are seen to be putting out this propaganda. But the places where it counts, like the United States, which is enabling, which is making this genocide possible, and most people think, well, Israeli really suffered on October. So didn't you see that Israeli case on Friday? And they will not have seen my Irish barrister favorite person on Thursday. I mean, it speaks for itself.
Obviously, I would have, for many reasons, I wanted Vivek Ramaswamy to have a good showing. I was rooting for him to have a good showing. I think that he was really the thing that I loved about Vivek's campaign was that there's this problem within there's a lot of problems within the kind of new conservative movement or the new right. But one of the major ones is that, and I'll kind of forgive them to some degree for this, because there is something about the fact that every awful Republican for my entire life has wrapped themselves in our language, in libertarian language. They do this with all of their worst policies. I mean, look, what was the name of the Iraq war? It was called Operation Iraqi Freedom. That's what they call it. They wrap all of their bullshit in libertarian language. And that is very damaging, because it's like, if you call the Iraq war Operation Iraqi Freedom, it tends to have this effect where people will be, if you bring up freedom, they're like, oh, I don't know, I'm associating that with this thing. And the Republicans for so many years have all talked about limited government and balanced budgets and things like this. And at this point, they've created a situation where those words just sound so empty and hollow. You almost roll your eyes at them. I mean, when Nikki Haley is up there talking about limited government or whatever, does anybody think that government is going to be limited under Nikki Haley? It's just something you roll your eyes at. And every Republican presidential administration increases the size and scope of government. And that kind of resulted in Donald Trump, when he came up, just being like, I'm not even talking about that anymore. Forget it. In fact, he ran on like, we're not going to cut any entitlements or, things like that. And so I love that Vivek's campaign actually was connecting the America First, the MAGA movement with a drastic reduction in the size and scope of government, which is so necessary. It's like such a missing component to their thing. Because if you actually want to drain the swamp, the only way to do that is to drastically cut spending, which is what no Republicans ever do. They may cut some taxes for rich people. They'll do that occasionally, but they never cut spending. And that's the whole thing right there. That's the swamp. The swamp is government spending. Why do you think it is that there's more millionaires in Washington, D.C. and the suburbs around it than anywhere else in the world? Because they're, it's not because they're producing so much stuff there. It's not capitalism. It's not like, there's these great big factories where they're making all types of stuff that everyone else wants. It's because the politically connected people live there, and the federal government spends $6 trillion a year. So there's $6 trillion to dole out to politically connected people. And so I love that about Vivek's campaign, that he was bringing those issues up. And of course, he's done the show 4 times. And, so that kind of makes you go like, oh, that's cool that he wants to come and talk to us. He came and talked to a lot of different libertarians and were kind of courting us. But you got to live in reality. And the reality is it just didn't work. And so he dropped out, and he's supporting Trump. And I guess he's going to be speaking at a Trump rally tomorrow is what he was saying. So that's the latest update here.
Big picture takeaway from that, and I don't mean to be, again, too dark as you said on this, but it is not, if we are worried about the rise of authoritarianism in this country, we are worried about potential rise of fascism in this country, if we're worried about our democracy falling to an authoritarian and potentially fascist form of government, the leader who is trying to do that is part of that equation. But people wanting that is a much bigger part of that equation. And the American electorate is made up of 2 major parties. One of those parties has been flirting with extremism on the ultra-right for a very long time. They've brought them in a way that they haven't been central to Republican electoral politics ever before, and I know because I've been studying this. But once you have radicalized one major party, so that those are the preferences of the people who adhere to your party, the leaders are interchangeable. And yes, Trumpism is sometimes what we call it. MAGA movement is probably a better way to do it, but there is an authoritarian movement inside Republican politics that isn't being bamboozled by Trump. They are pushing Trump to get more and more extreme, because the more extreme things he says, the more they adhere to that. And that is coming from a very large proportion of the American right that adheres to the Republican Party. And that's why this is a Republican Party problem more than it is the problem of one man and his leaders.
It's just unbelievable. It's just unbelievable, man. And like Rachel Maddow, I think people should remember, is not a stupid person. She was once kind of smart. And she's just, but it's unbelievable how much Trump has made these people stupid. Like when you get, and I'm sure we've all experienced this in life, when you get too emotional and it makes you stupid. You know what I'm talking about? Like if you have a very emotional reaction to something, you're typically not being logical. You're not thinking things through. And it's unbelievable to watch her say this. First of all, like she's talking about the rise of authoritarianism. Like, what do these terms even mean? The rise of authoritarianism. Like, lady, our country was locked down and we all watched you cheer it on. So don't tell me you have this profound concern about the rise of authoritarianism. We've seen the most authoritarian policies debatably in our country's history, or at least like on the widest scale in our country's history. And you've loved it. Now, by the way, just to be clear here, it's like, this is why these words mean nothing to them. Look, even if you were going to, let's say, defend lockdowns, I'm just picking an example because it's the easiest example to pick. But let's say you were defending lockdowns in 2020 and you were saying, no, because COVID is such a, health emergency, we need lockdowns. Now, forget the fact that we know that the lockdowns didn't work and all of this stuff. But let's just say that was your position and you thought it was necessary to have lockdowns in order to slow the spread or flatten the curve or whatever. Then by definition, you are for authoritarianism. Now, you may think it's justified authoritarianism, but you're on the side of authoritarianism by definition. Like, that's what it is. And so for you to sit here and be like, we're concerned about the rise of authoritarianism. I mean, look at the country we live in. Who thinks we're not living through the rise of authoritarianism? And by the way, again, I'm not a Trump fan. Trump was very responsible for those lockdowns. I mean, he may not have been a governor who did it himself, but he certainly was cheering it on. He's the one who invoked the national emergency to begin with. He gave cover to them. He sent funding to the people who were doing the lockdowns. Like, he's responsible. But that's what this is, the rise of authoritarianism, the rejection of democracy as you're trying to get a guy removed from the ballot.
A little bit about the election yesterday. When you think about it, it wasn't a tremendous number of people, but it got a lot of attention and people watch it, and it is significant, and sometimes it's significant in a very negative way. And I keep complaining about this big struggle going on between left and right and the peaceful people and the warmongers. And we have to change things because the end of the world will come if we have the same president. And a lot of these arguments can be plausible, but I'll tell you, the long term, and even my feeling right now is, there was a definite winner last night. Trump did win, and there's a lot of momentum, and Trump is probably going to be the candidate, and probably there's a very good chance he'll be the next president. But if we're honest with ourselves, what really should the American people expect? Is this sort of like, oh, good Lord, this is wonderful. Now we don't have to listen to Biden anymore, and we will have a change in policy. And that's where I come up short, because I'm afraid the Republicans don't have a good reputation. We know the good guys there, and there's a few, and even some Democrats will have to open up their minds on occasion and work with us. But when you come to describing, sound economic policy, sound monetary policy, balancing the budget, having a foreign policy of common sense, all these things, it's just not there. I would say this whole campaign, where Iowa got a lot of attention, they didn't really talk about foreign policy the way we would like to have them talk. So it's something that puts me in a position where, I have very low expectations on this. But somebody said, "What do you mean? Anybody is better than Biden?" And I'm not so sure about that. Sometimes if you have an aggressive person, maybe changing a few things, but not changing the big things, maybe the ineptness of a president, maybe they'll slow him up. But since the president's really not our president, and people pull the strings, it's still very dangerous. So it's healthy for the nation to get a different president. But I'm still very cautious in saying, boy, this is really a big deal, and this is going to be very helpful. Because when I think of the last administration before Biden, we were using, and Trump does support sanctions, but the Democrats and most Republicans support that. They don't even talk about or challenge, the power of the Fed to manipulate interest rates and manage the economy, which is really the big problem. Is you wouldn't have all this runaway spending if you didn't have the Fed. And we have a notion, and there will be a difference in foreign policy about who's really defending our presence around the world, who will be the strongest in defending America. And that can backfire, because, the way you do it, do you do it with diplomatic relationships and working out things, or do you do it by, just shouting and threatening and saying, if you don't go our way, we're going to put sanctions on you. We might even bomb you. Like right now, what we're doing is we're over in the Middle East bombing certain countries. Some people, including myself, have thought, well, maybe that war will be toned down in Syria and Iraq. No, it's a hot spot of the world right now, and we have a confrontation with Iran. But I never did hear very much discussion on this. So, Daniel, I think that I cautiously say there's hope for a beneficial change. But right now, I would say the momentum is in the direction of the American people feeling better with anybody who would defend the empire, because they've made it an issue of patriotism.
Yeah, I think the other thing, speaking of principles, Dr. Paul, the other takeaway for me is the departure of Vivek Ramaswamy. Now, we didn't agree with everything he said. We had him on the show a couple times. We met him in D.C. He spent $30 million of his own dollars on this campaign. He worked himself to the bone. He took on the mainstream media. He exposed the corruption of the mainstream media and the political process. Again, as disappointed as I was with some of his positions, and he's now trending on Twitter X right now, I think a big takeaway is, in a way, a star is born. I think he has an enormous amount to offer to the American political scene right now. I think he was the only one speaking intelligently about these issues. And for one, I do hope he sticks around, because I think he's a very interesting and energetic 38 years old. And he took on all of these people. He bowed out graciously when he did not get the result he was hoping for in Iowa. He didn't blame anyone. He endorsed Trump and bowed out gracefully. I do think he has a future. I don't know how you feel about it, Dr. Paul.
Well, I think it's very interesting, and you're absolutely right. He's the one that has come the closest in that. We wanted and was quite willing to talk to him, but he approached us. That to me is a real compliment for our program, because we know how much moderation we have and influence. We have a small program, but it's interesting that he looked to one that he said is telling the truth. And I doubt if he's the kind that's going to walk away and be despondent and discouraged, because some people think in a race like that, some of those that have dropped out already, they're done. They've had their chance and it's all over with. But in another way, and you alluded to it, Daniel, that this might not be that he's finished. He's just beginning. He's young. He's talent. He's willing to spend his own money, and he had a lot of basic principles. So I look forward to wonder what he's going to do next.
Yeah. Well, speaking of, I'm sorry.
One thing is not be able to walk away from it.
Yeah, I hope not. Well, you mentioned as we began that there has not been a lot of debate on foreign policy, and I think that's the case. Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis are both neocons in their foreign policy, and they've been very aggressive. But there are things happening, and we both noticed this morning on antiwar.com that just as bombs are flying in the Middle East, well, the New Jersey National Guard is going to send 1,500 troops to Iraq and Syria. So that's an occupation force. To me, it looks like they're sending some sitting ducks over there.
Yeah, so the goals for the empire exist forever, and I think how they win that is how they get people to go along with war, because they always use the patriotism statement. If you're not for the war and you're not for the troops going over there and dying for needless causes, then you're unpatriotic. You don't like America, and we've talked about that a whole lot. But that's the thing that has to be overcome. And eventually, though, I think people will decide enough is enough, and that's when the country has admitted its bankruptcy. And quite frankly, I think we're getting very close to that point.